This is going to be a lecture on breed-specific nutritional disorders. It is a subject that I've been involved in and spent a lot of time gathering resources about, so I'm really glad to be putting this together in a format that hopefully will be informative, whether you're here from ANS 564. So getting started, I think this is a pretty interesting one because it also kind of goes back to just the evolutionary basis of domesticating dogs in general. So I really like this one. It's less of a breed-specific disorder. It's more, or really even disorder, it's just a deficiency and kind of difference. But it's seen in the northern breed group, which includes dogs like Malamutes, Chow Chows, Huskies, Akitas, Shibas, anything that you can think of that's been around for a really long time and has a curly tail and pointy ears. So what this is a deficiency in, or just really not having as much as other dogs, of amylase, which is one of the enzymes secreted by the pancreas and also the salivary glands, although only in dogs. Cats don't have salivary amylase. And it aids with the breakdown of dietary starches. But in this northern breed group, it seems like the genes that encode for amylase, they have significantly less of them compared to the rest of just the domesticated canine population. And what studies have found recently is that during the process of domestication, the DNA sequences that encode for amylase increased by 500% compared to what you would see in like a wolf or a wild dog. But in these breeds, that happened significantly less. Even in Huskies, it looks like it almost happened not at all. And they have genetic material to do this similar to like what a wolf would have. And the theory for this is that given that dogs were domesticated alongside human populations, they obviously needed to evolve to be able to eat our scraps, which for some more modern breeds that differentiated in European cultures, like a German Shepherd or a Bulldog or something like that, those diets were heavily skewed towards carbohydrates like breads, pasta, I guess. So the proliferation of those genes that would encode for amylase were really essential for their ability to thrive. Although some of these northern breeds, most likely they evolved alongside human populations where the diet was more meat-based. So really there was just less selective pressure to be able to effectively break down starches, so they just didn't have the need to develop the genetic potential as much as some other breeds did. Although interestingly, with Siberian Huskies, they think that the reason that there's an even more significant decrease in Huskies is because they bred back with wolves after their domestication. So really, the way this manifests itself is, some of these breeds just may have trouble having good stool quality on a modern kibble, so they just might have frequent bouts of diarrhea or just kind of liquidy stool in general. I wouldn't say, I'm definitely not suggesting that if you have one of these breeds, you need to feed them like just meat, because that would not be balanced. It just means you may have to experiment to find what works best for your dog. I know I personally have an Akita, so I kind of dealt with this for a while because he just would like have the poopsies every 3 or 4 months for like 2 weeks connected to absolutely nothing. Like we tested him for all sorts of things and it was just like, nope. He's just like that. So really it just took experimenting a lot to find the right kind of kibble and like a really high quality kibble. So ever since I put him on a mixture of a couple of different Purina Pro Plan varieties, it helped it a lot. So that's just kind of my experience with it. And I think this is an interesting one as well because there's a kind of cool evolutionary basis for why it might be happening. This is one that we see in Miniature Schnauzers. It is hypertriglyceridemia, which is a metabolic disorder that causes an abnormal accumulation of low-density lipoproteins, which is essentially bad cholesterol across the body and in the internal organs. It has an age-related aspect with dogs under 3 years old. About 15% of them are affected, and as they get older, we see that about 75% of miniature schnauzers over 9 years old may have it. And the main distinction is that it's suspected to have a genetic component rather than just being the result of obesity or a poor diet, which makes this unique from just generalized what you might see in larger dogs that aren't healthy. And when they get diagnosed, you often need lab work to determine how severe it is. They will have high levels of protein in the urine, and I'll explain why that happens in a minute, but also their fasted triglyceride levels will be elevated, and there might also be an abnormal increase in liver enzymes. And also when you actually pull the blood, the serum itself after it's spun is usually lipemic, which you can see in the picture. It's like very yellowy and it's not really the color it's supposed to be. Hypertriglyceridemia itself can cause something called glomerular disease, which I probably did not say right, but I'll just tell you what it is. And that's when their kidneys don't function appropriately and can't really filter waste products out of the blood, which is why you see the protein in the urine, because it's leaking out and getting into the urine, and sometimes even red blood cells can be found in the urine as well. It also predisposes them to pancreatitis and seizures, and rarely it can result in the accumulation of lipids in the corneas, which obstructs the vision and can cause irritation and other issues with being able to see well. There isn't a cure, but dietary management can be helpful in delaying the onset of severe cases. The recommendation is feeding a low-fat diet with less than 25 grams of total fat per 100 calories. And that's kind of the recommendation that seems to at least slow any progression of bad symptoms. And then also if it has progressed and caused glomerular disease, then you can put them on a reduced protein food as well. If that doesn't help, there are some medications that help stabilize triglyceride concentrations, but in humans, those can have fairly severe side effects. We don't really know about dogs yet, but it's generally not the best recommendation if you can do other things to manage it from a dietary perspective. And it's not super well studied exactly why it's happening. Like I said, it's not related to being overweight or having a poor diet, so it's most likely genetic, but that has not been as well researched in some of the other ones that I'll talk about later, where they've actually identified the specific genetic mutation or issue. Zinc-responsive dermatitis. This one, there's actually two distinct forms of it. I will briefly explain type 2 because it is a nutritional issue rather than a genetic issue. And type 2 is when there is a zinc deficiency in the body due to the high presence of the anti-nutritional compound phytate, which comes from raw soybeans, and it can bind the zinc and make them unable to actually absorb it from the diet. For some reason, the symptoms seem to occur most frequently in large breed puppies. So that's type 2. There's also type 1, which is that's hereditary, and whether or not the dog is getting a diet that is low in phytate and has enough zinc, they can still develop the symptoms of it. The symptoms of which being hair loss, redness, crusty lesions, sensitivity around the eyes and mouth, and sometimes even the urogenital area. And as I said, that can occur whether or not they're getting an appropriate amount of zinc in their diet or not, because there's this supposed genetic defect in their ability to absorb it in the small intestine, despite having enough in it being available. So generally it's diagnosed just by obtaining a history because it's well documented in these breeds. Alaskan Malamutes and Siberian Huskies, and the symptoms are pretty distinctive. And sometimes you can do a skin biopsy, which may show some histological changes to the skin cells, but once they kind of figure out what's going on, seeing, the weird skin symptoms, it's pretty easy to deal with because you can just supplement to the diet. Studies have shown that about almost 90% of the cases can resolve in as little as like 3 days if you begin adding additional zinc at the concentration of 1 milligram per kilogram to their diet. This one, I'm not even going to try and pronounce it because I am certain I would butcher that name. But I do think this is an interesting one because it can sometimes happen in people. Although in dogs, it's found in border collies, Australian shepherds, and rarely also in beagles. And there is a genetic test for it that costs about $50, and it is transmitted as a simple recessive gene. So that means that carriers won't show any symptoms. They have to have 2 copies of the gene to be affected at all. And with this genetic test, hopefully that means that breeders can prevent producing affected puppies that have the disorder. But what it does is it causes the inability to absorb vitamin B12, which is cobalamin. And cobalamin is important for just a huge variety of bodily functions. So when this does occur, the symptoms are usually seen pretty early, even in puppies as young as 2 weeks of age, although typically diagnosis occurs between 5 and 12 weeks. It really manifests as just like a failure to thrive, although if lab tests are done, you may also see decreased white blood cells and anemia. Unlike with some of the other, like the zinc-responsive dermatitis, you can't really just add more vitamin B12 into the diet to fix it because the specific mutation causes really a complete lack of the receptor that helps transport cobalamin from the lumen of the small intestine across the microvilli for absorption. So really, you can't just give them more. But what they have found is that you can do an intramuscular injection of just 1 milligram every 4 to 5 months, and that can it does have to be done for their entire life, but that really completely resolves any negative effects that may happen because of this. This one is kind of a more interesting and special one to me because I actually have a dog who has hyperuricosuriasia. She's in all these pictures. She's so cute. I thought everybody needed to look at her. But this is one that really affects almost the entire population of Dalmatians. I think it's probably one of the more well-known metabolic disorders out there in purebred dogs. Dalmatians who are homozygous for the mutated gene are called high uric acid, or just HUA. So what that means is that most Dalmatians cannot effectively process purines, which is the class of molecule that makes up the nucleic acids guanine and adenine. So they're key components of DNA. Any plant or animal material that's eaten will release it into the digestive system and the body. And like I said, the HUA Dalmatians can't effectively metabolize purines into a safe form. Normally, animals that don't have this, when the body breaks down purines, the end product is something called uric acid. Most species are able, and breeds really, are able to convert uric acid into a form that's easily excretable, and that's called allantoin. But Dalmatians do not lack the ability to fully convert all of the uric acid into this final compound, which leads to a buildup of an intermediate, which is called urate. And urate then can accumulate in the urinary tract in a crystalline form, which can become stones in the bladder and infrequently sometimes in the kidneys as well. And then, of course, stones which get big enough to block the ureter may need to be surgically removed, and in rare cases it has caused death. Although that sounds a little bit scarier than it really is, because while all Dalmatians are, well, there's a caveat to that I'll talk about later. All Dalmatians are HUA. that doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to form stones. It more means that they're predisposed to it. It's not necessarily like a sentence that they have these genes that means that they're going to. Even within a single litter, some might form stones, some may not. And studies have actually shown that the overall incidence in the population of forming stones and having issues with like the clinical symptoms of urinary calculi is almost as low as 1%. And that small percentage is pretty vastly overrepresented in male dogs, which is kind of similar to, if you know anything about or worked in large animal, what happens with male goats and wethers when they get stones. And it's really just because the ureter is longer and it's narrower, so there's more time for the crystals to build up and it's easier for them to get stuck, creating a blockage. But females and many males also are usually able to excrete the crystals in kind of like people call it like a sludge, which is kind of gross, but also accurate. But okay, so before I get into how it's managed, I do want to also mention the low uric acid outcross program, which is why I was saying it's not the entire 100% full population of Dalmatians that are affected. So what this was back in the 70s, there was a veterinarian who bred one of his pointers to one of his Dalmatians, whose name was Lady Godiva. I think that's an adorable fun fact. I love that name. And this produced an entire line of dogs who only carried, sometimes they carry none, but generally one copy of the damaged purine metabolism gene. But unfortunately, it took away from kind of the breed look, and it took until 2011, I believe it was 2011, for the AKC to allow the low uric acid lines to be registered. So since then, that means that it's not the entire population anymore, because there are these low uric acid Dalmatians, which they don't form urate crystals, but it is important to note that they can still form other types of crystals, like struvite crystals, for example. And then normally when a litter using one or two low uric acid dogs, it's still important to test all the puppies, because you can still create a HUA dog from a variety of options for those pairings. So it's important to know what each puppy's specific status is. All right, so in terms of dietary management, it sounds a little bit complicated, but once you get the basics, it's really not that bad. I have not had any trouble with it whatsoever. It's really just a matter of avoiding high purine ingredients. So those specifically, usually it's protein source that the variation occurs in, but some of the ones to avoid are organ meats, especially liver. Liver's terrible. Trout, tuna, small oily fish like anchovies kind of thing. Also game meats, and then yeast. So a decent number of foods have brewer's yeast, I can't talk, and that would be one to avoid. So it means that when you're choosing a food, it's important to look at the ingredients list to make sure that there's not any of those problematic things on it, and see what the food is actually based off of. So brewer's yeast, like I said, that's one. And then also anything that just says fish meal, because there are safe fish and there's unsafe fish. So if you don't know what kind of fish it is, that's a good one to avoid. And then also some foods use liver as like a palatability agent. So that might be lower down there on the list, but you have to check for that as well. And then some of the safer options would be chicken, eggs, turkey, duck, white fish like cod, and then salmon is pretty okay as well. Another best practice for picking out foods that are safe is to try to look for one with a lower protein percentage, because a lot of the purine variation is based on protein source. Most carbohydrates are pretty much safe across the board. But foods, they don't really test specifically for purine levels, but given it's largely based on the protein source, if you try to find one that's lower protein, you will hopefully be lower purine kind of by default. There's not really like a hard and fast cutoff on what that number should be. I mean, I just know personally what I feed is about 26%, and that's pretty consistent with any of my friends who have Dalmatians. So just staying low, not too low, but definitely not like high 20s, low 30s, any of those crazy foods that are out there right now. And then lastly, you can also help them expel any urate crystals out of their bladder by encouraging them to drink a lot of water and taking them out to use the bathroom a lot. And one way I like to do that, just kind of a pro tip, is to add water to their kibble, which makes them drink the water, and also they think it's super fun, so I think that's a good one too. So there are a couple of different mechanisms by which copper storage disease can occur. A few of them are hereditary, so I'll talk about some of those. There are some genetic disorders that damage copper metabolism, and as a result, copper will accumulate in the liver. So copper storage disease is really considered secondary to these mutations. Breeds where that occurs are Dalmatians. Again, we have it rough a little bit. Cocker Spaniels, Labrador Retrievers, and Doberman Pinschers. But I think the Doberman one is pretty interesting too, because the mutation is believed to be sex-linked, so it's generally only females who are damaged by the hereditary form of it. However, in Bedlington Terriers, copper storage disease is considered a primary disorder because the genetic mutation directly affects their ability to move copper out of the liver at all. It's not just a generalized metabolic problem. This is due to an autosomal recessive genetic mutation that results in copper building up in the liver over time, so it worsens in severity as the dog gets older. In normal dogs, the amount of copper in the liver is between 200 and 400 parts per million, but in Bedlington Terriers, this can reach over 10,000 parts per million, so that's wildly elevated. And that increase begins at birth and just continues to accumulate, although generally clinical signs don't show up until between 4 and 8 years of age, although that is not a hard and fast rule. Sometimes it's younger, sometimes it's older. But the symptoms of in Bedlington Terriers and copper storage disease as a whole, no matter what the mechanism behind it is, the symptoms start with weight loss and excessive urination, excessive drinking water, and then can progress to jaundice, which is yellowing of the white parts of the eye, and also abdominal pain and vomiting. And when biopsies of the liver are done, it will show fat deposits indicating damage and also cell death. Although in some very rare cases, it can cause sudden death because of an acute episode of liver necrosis. So that's kind of a scary possibility there. There is some ability to nutritionally manage this. Of course, you would think feeding a copper-restricted diet would help, but unfortunately, that's a little bit more complicated than you would think for reasons I will explain in just a minute. But the second option is to try and increase the rate of copper excretion through the urine using a chelating agent that can bind and remove copper that's been stored in the liver. Although unfortunately these medications that can help with this have fairly significant side effects, so it's really, it kind of just depends. Although recently there have been some, oh, there goes my dogs. Sorry, I'm just going to keep going. Recently, there have been some worrying trends showing that copper storage disease cases may be rising across the canine population as a whole, because copper storage disease, it can occur because of issues with copper metabolism, but it can also occur just in any dog if they're being fed a diet that's way too high in copper. So unfortunately, that might be occurring. Up until 2007, AFCO had an established upper limit for copper inclusion in the diet. However, that number was based on studies in pigs, so they decided to remove it, like I said, in 2007, and they have not reinstated it. And some veterinarians believe that this, along with the fact that vitamin and mineral premixes, the sources for anything copper, zinc, whatever in there, are leaning towards more bioavailable versions, which may mean that there's actually more copper being absorbed just because it's really an easier source for the body to obtain it from. So that could be unintentionally leading to diets that are exceeding the safe upper limit for dogs. So one study that showed this could be the case was looking at 116 dogs between 2015 and 2020, so after that upper limit was removed. All dogs with confirmed fatty liver issues, which is, as I said, a hallmark of liver damage. Out of all of those, 81% had copper levels above the established normal upper limit, which, as I said, is 400 parts per million. So that indicates that there may be kind of a situation-wide issue with foods having too much copper right now. I don't know. It just seems that that's a possibility and could be an indication. Although after this kind of came out and veterinarians and researchers started presenting this as a possibility and a possible issue, AAFCO did come back with a statement, which I wrote down. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, so what they said when presented with these issues was, at this time, AAFCO does not see the need to restrict the use of other sources of copper in dog foods beyond any restrictions already imposed in their definitions or approvals. Until such time as science definitively shows additional controls or restrictions are needed, AAFCO feels that recommendations for copper concentrations in food for normal dogs are appropriate and sufficiently regulated at present. So that's kind of just an interesting example of how some of these even breed-specific issues are just a smaller example of things that are happening in the wider world of canine nutrition as a whole. That gets me to the end of my little presentation here. This is obviously not an exhaustive list of every single nutritional disorder that's out there, but I did try and choose the ones that are more common or have some broader applications, especially like that last one. So hopefully you found it interesting. And I have included some resources for just additional learning and interest if that's something that you want to look into. So please feel free to check any of these out as well. Thanks for listening.